Thanks. So first off, have some cookies. My wife and her friend Cassie made them. So hopefully those cookies will let you guys have a better experience. Yes, that's what we're here to talk about tonight. It's crafting experiences with data visualization. Now, we're storytellers. We call ourselves storytellers. And data visualization, we're creating stories about data. And so to begin the talk, I'd like to start off by telling you guys a story. So this story happened a couple weeks ago to me. It involved a terrifying experience. I was sitting down at work all day and programming, how it goes. Came home, programmed some more, and it's midnight. My legs are tired, my body's tired, and I want to go to sleep, but I feel like shit, so I'm going to go exercise. So I put on my gym clothes, I go outside, and I start jogging. And I live in North Berkeley. North Berkeley, there are some streets that aren't very well lit, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through my jog, and I'm running down this one street. It's a really long street, and it's spaced with light poles. So there's darkness and then light, darkness and light. And up ahead in the distance, I can see the small figure, and I can't tell if it's coming at me or going away from me. And, North Berkeley at night, I'm not scared, but I take off my headphones, kind of grip my phone a little bit. I don't like to leave my foot hanging off the bed when I'm sleeping, so it kind of gives you the state of my mind. So I have to kind of bring my mind back in, realize it's okay, it's fine. So I'm still jogging, and the figure steps into the light, and I make it out, and it's a woman. So I think, whew, I can take her. Like, this is okay. So, but then immediately, I start panicking because it's midnight. I'm kind of a tall guy. I have a beard. I'm wearing a dark hoodie, and I don't want to terrify her. I'm, running behind her, panning really heavily. So immediately, I take off my hoodie. I'm like, okay. So I'm still jogging. I don't want to turn back because I'm already 3/4 of the way done. So all these things start going through my head. What can I do? Okay, maybe I can cross the street. Now there's some cars coming every once in a while. I don't want to get hit. What if I slow down and then I just kind of walk and then maybe eventually she'll turn down the street or something? But then if she does that and she turns around and she sees this tall guy in a black hoodie stalking her, don't want to terrify her. So maybe I don't need to say anything at all. Just keep running. I mean, I'm breathing really heavily, right? So she'll know that I'm coming. But that's probably not a good idea either. So maybe I can shout ahead. But all of this time I'm running and I'm not realizing how close I'm getting to her. And so before I can do anything, she turns around, she jumps, and she screams and clutches her chest, bends over, and so I just start laughing. I put up my hands like, I'm sorry. I don't want to have a conversation with her, but I want to let her know that I'm not a creeper. So I'm sorry, I'm running, I didn't mean to scare you. And she turns and she says, well, you did. So I just kind of do the awkward wave. I don't know what to do. So I start running home and I stick to the lighted streets. So what does that talk have anything to do with data viz? Nothing really. But we're talking about crafting experiences, and you all know what an experience is. But this is a data visualization talk. Let's visualize an experience. And just like any kind of data you visualize, there are an infinite number of ways to do it. This is one that I found to be really helpful. It's viewing an experience in terms of interest over time. And if we kind of look at the story that I told, this interest curve may not match your interest in the story. Maybe your interest was really flat and you didn't really care. But this was a technique that I used to help structure the story. And we start with the hook. Just like any kind of book or a movie, there's an explosion right off the bat to get you interested. And let's look at what I tried to do. So I started off by saying I was sitting down. Hopefully that established some empathy. You guys probably sit down, so maybe there's some interest there. And then if not, I used a really cheap trick just by saying it's going to be terrifying. It's just like an explosion or a death at the beginning of a movie or a book. It's cheap, but it works. It's a hook. And then we have to have these valleys where basically it's not that interesting, but the point of these valleys is to make the peaks to let those sink in, to make those peaks interesting. If it's all just peak, 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 nothing will really sink in. You know, if you're rich and you're always eating caviar, like caviar won't be that interesting. But if you're eating bread all week and then you can have some ice cream on a Friday, like that's an interesting experience, right? And so, you know, we just kind of have these peaks and valleys all the way up until the end, and then kind of fade off and the experience ends. Now we can apply this, you know, to a book or a movie, anything that has a typical like 3-act structure. You know, we've got the hook, we've got the climax for Act 1, Act 2, and then Act 3's climax, which is the culmination of the experience, what everything kind of goes to. And this applies to data visualization. It may not seem that way because I'm talking about like these temporal stories that we tell over time. And you may think, well, I'm developing a bar chart or I'm developing pie charts. I'm not telling a story. But if you have a lot of data, then you need to you don't just want to give the user all the data at once. It's going to be overwhelming, and you're not going to be able to emphasize the things that you want to emphasize. And throughout this whole talk, the crux of this talk is about focusing on the user, putting the user first and putting the technology second. So, you know, this won't be a really technical talk. I won't really be showing any code. I'm going to be doing something that I think is a lot harder than programming or learning D3, and that's about crafting experiences. You know, when you program, you have a debugger, you have a console, you can open it up, you can say, does this work, does this not work? It's really easy to know if something's working or not working. But when you're creating an experience, that's in a person's mind. We don't have the technology yet to open up somebody's mental console and run a couple of debug statements or do a stack trace. It's really hard to know if an experience you're creating is working or not. And you know, this experience, this interest curve, this can be applied not to just books or movies. You know, this kind of looks like a roller coaster. Real life experiences are also this way. We can structure any kind of experience that involves another person, where the other person's interest is more important than your own. Just like, you know, some other real life physical experiences. So now that we know what an experience kind of looks like, let's get to the meat of the talk. Let's talk about how we craft an experience. So let's talk about how we craft experiences. Now I mentioned, you know, the audience, the user is the most important. Like that's who you're developing a visualization for. With that in mind, you know, you guys are data visualizers. You can understand things, data visualizations, that the average layperson might have a hard time understanding. So with that in mind, this next slide is kind of a culmination of all this tips and tricks and secrets I've learned with regards to crafting experiences. And it's kind of dense, so you know, we'll go slow. We'll pick apart each piece, and hopefully, you know, I spent a lot of time on it, so hopefully you guys will appreciate it. So let's take a look. You probably thought that the loading bar was not what I wanted to show. If we're going to talk about crafting experiences, let's start at the beginning. When you load a web page, when you load a visualization, this loading bar is probably the first thing that a user sees. And I think it's kind of ridiculous to, you know, if let's say you're doing a map visualization and you have a 5 megabyte GeoJSON file, it's a little absurd to expect the user to wait while that 5 megabyte GeoJSON file loads. Like you're not taking advantage of that hook, that initial experience that the user has. You know, let's use this loading process. Let's use a little misdirection to create a better experience. It sounds a little nebulous, so let's talk about a couple ways that we can do that. And you know, I'm kind of hating on loading bars, but loading bars actually serve a purpose. You know, sometimes you have a lot of information that you need to show, but you want to give those valleys of interest You want to like let that loading process sink in so the user knows what's coming. And so one technique that I've used to some success has been adding loading bars where there wasn't one already. And I did this with the first startup that I founded with my co-founder. We founded Outline.com, and we were doing visualizations of the financial impacts of public policy changes. So if you change income tax by 5%, how's that going to impact financially everybody in the country? It's kind of a hard problem. The current state-of-the-art system that the government uses, a lot of think tanks use, the current state-of-the-art system will take literally days to do these micro simulations. There's over 300 million records, tens of thousands of calculations need to happen on each record, so it's understandable that it takes a little time. But before I get in, I want to give a shout out to Ian, because for about 2 weeks I was constantly pestering him with math help and help with OpenCL, which is a parallel computing framework that I use to drastically reduce the time that these calculations took. So with the current state-of-the-art system, to run 300 million records, tens of thousands of calculations each, takes about 3 or 4 days. With the system that we developed, it takes 100 milliseconds. And this is kind of cool from a technical standpoint, I think. But I'm not saying this to brag, because when I first created this and I hooked it up, I started dragging around these income tax sliders and seeing the changes on a map. And it was happening in real time. Before I could even release the mouse, the calculations were done. And I thought this was the coolest thing ever, right? Like, I can move a slider and see how every single tax record in the country is impacted. I was blown away, but I also made it, so I understood what was happening. And it was shocking at the time that when we gave this demo to people, we even gave this demo to the economists that we were working with at MIT, and when they dragged the sliders, the response was, oh, this looks good. When is this going to work? People did not believe that this was actually hooked up and working. And it was a little frustrating at first, because no, we're telling you it works. Every person that we gave this demo to, we gave it to the governor of Massachusetts, nobody believed that it worked. People wanted it to be slower, right? I mean, that would be the cop-out. It would say, oh, people want it to be slow. People have these expectations that technology can't be that fast. But it's a subtle thing. Anytime a user goes into an experience, they have these expectations about what the experience will be like. So the experience you provide has to, at least in some way, match their mental model of what they expect. And if we're telling you that we're running these calculations in real time, 300 million records, tens of thousands of calculations, it's happening before you can even release the mouse, people might think it's cool, but nobody really groks it. They don't fully understand it. And I didn't either. If I step outside of my little bubble, being a designer, and I step into the role of a user, that makes sense. It's not really believable, I expect that this calculation involves work, and work takes time. I expect that there's tens of thousands of accountants filling out forms, doing these calculations, and then with calculators and all this stuff. There's this expectation that this experience, I need to wait to get these results. And so we tried a couple things. We added a calculate button. That still didn't work. You press calculate, it's done instantly. Didn't work. Nobody believed it. So I'd like to show you what we did real fast. So this is Outline. We'll come to the map here. This is showing the difference between the current budget and the proposed budget. So if we change income tax here, let's bump income tax up to 9.5%. Calculation's actually done at this point. No additional work needs to happen. But nobody believes that, right? That's not a good user experience. So we added this button. That wasn't enough. So now when you click this button, you see this. And that's all misdirection. It's done. Those numbers mean nothing. It's a random value between 7 and 10 seconds. It just shows numbers spinning really fast. People get it. It sounds kind of crazy, but if we approached it in terms of us as developers or designers, it's like we want to have like this instant feedback. As programmers, we want instant feedback. We want to change a variable, see the value immediately. But as a user, this is all dependent on the experience you're creating, of course. But as a user, if you're expecting a calculation, you're going to expect that it takes some time. And when we showed that, people got it immediately. It was a completely different experience just by adding this loading bar. Something that we take for granted. We take for granted that you just have these loading bars, and we're blind to it. We don't even think that it's something we can take advantage of. But that's not usually the case. Usually you don't have the luxury of being so fast you need to add a loading bar. Normally you're going to be bottlenecked by a network request or disk I/O. Usually you will have some sort of waiting process. And when you do, let's use some misdirection to make it better, to kind of teach the user what to expect. So with the current startup, we realized we wouldn't be able to achieve the vision that we wanted with Outline. So my co-founder Nikita and I, we abandoned Outline and we pursued a new startup. We call it 5. One of the things that we're exploring was this divide between your real-life identity and your identity online. And to explore this a little bit, we created this project called labs.5.com. And what we do is we take in your Facebook wall post, we run some machine learning on it, and we spit out a personality for you. We're using the Big 5 personality theory. It's kind of the cutting edge theory of what personality is like. And maybe you've not heard of it because it kind of tells a bad story. You get these 5 traits. You get openness, extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you probably have in your mind like what extroversion means. Like, oh, I don't like people, I'm introverted. But it's a little more subtle than that. Like extroversion, if you're extroverted, you tend to gain energy by being around people. Like maybe I don't like being with you guys, but I just get so much energy out of it. Like that would be extroversion. But it's really hard to tell that because it's like this subtle, kind of scientific understanding of personality. There's this other thing called Myers-Briggs. This is way more common. You've probably heard of it. At the risk of being a turd in the punch bowl, Myers-Briggs is as scientifically accurate as astrology is. It has very little predictive power. The test, retest, the ability of taking the test once, taking it again. There's been studies where there's shown to be like a 60% chance that you'll end up with a different result. And if you're not familiar with Myers-Briggs, it's basically a test. You fill out some questions, and they give you a couple letters like ENTJ or SHIT. And there are these letters that you can attach to yourself to tell a story about yourself. Like I'm an ENTJ, and Einstein was an ENTJ. I'm Einstein. So the Myers-Briggs, it persists because it tells such a good story. And one of the problems that we wanted to solve with 5 Labs is that we want to tell an interesting story about who you are online, and Myers-Briggs isn't like that. That's kind of bullshit. So let's use the Big 5. And if we think about it in terms of the user first, the user wants to be able to tell a story about themselves. They want to press a button, know that something's working, and get a personality. So with the user in mind, with that perspective in mind of let's design a visualization based on the user's point of view, one of my favorite visualizations of all time, because I'm kind of a gaming nerd, I used to play these RPGs, and they'd have your stats, like your agility and your strength, and it'd be visualized in a radar chart. And I just thought that was so cool that you could get this shape to define you. And so with the Big 5 personality, there's 5 traits. So let's take those 5 traits, give each one of them as a dimension. Let's rotate them in polar coordinates, and we have a radar chart. So we have a shape that can describe you. Maybe it looks like a triangle. Maybe it looks like a big square. And just to give you a visualization, this is a radar chart. And if I put on my data viz hat and just think about this visualization just from a data viz perspective, there's a lot wrong with it. Yes, it's great if you want to compare, like in small multiples. If you want to see a bunch of them together, it works really well because you can see like what differences the shapes have. But if you're just seeing like a single shape, from a data viz, like pure data viz perspective, there are way more effective ways to do this. You know, like you could have 5 bar charts. That would give you like a more efficient, like better data visualization. Another thing too to note is that with a radar chart, the shape is completely arbitrary. You know, these dimensions, I could switch agreeableness and neuroticism, the shape would look different, and it's arbitrary. Like the way that you define the dimensions determines the shape. But what this allows us to do, though, is somebody can have a shape that's my shape. You know, like that's just a little more interesting. It's something, it's like a hook almost. You know, you see this and like, oh, I could have my own shape. So just showing somebody this shape, though, you know, we did some tests, and what we did was we hooked up this button. You would click this button, log in with Facebook, and it would spit out your shape. You know, you'd see this loading bar, of course, because we have to get data from Facebook. So you'd see this loading bar, which may take anywhere from 2 to 20 seconds, depending on how Facebook speed. And then you'd get the shape. The problem was that it wasn't really that believable. You know, like with Myers-Briggs, you have to actually fill out questions. You're doing some work to get a result. And with our algorithm, you've already done the work. You've already submitted your post to Facebook. We're just analyzing them. So there's like this sense that the user's not doing anything to get their data. So we have this loading bar. And you know, we could have just said, well, you know, we're screwed. Like we just have to wait on Facebook. Like we're limited by Facebook. And that's, you know, we wouldn't necessarily be wrong to think that, but that doesn't create a great experience. So what are some ways around this? You know, let's think from the user's point of view. Okay, like we want to teach the user, like what are our goals? We want to show the user that we're actually doing something, that you should believe this shape. Like this shape has meaning. How do we teach the user that? You know, like do we give them like a tutorial, like a user guide? Do we, you know, try to just tell them on the homepage that no, this is legitimate, just read it and believe it? Well, we have this loading process. Like, let's exploit that. Let's use some misdirection. It's not like, you know, we think of a loading bar. We think, okay, the server's 90% done. Let's tell the user it's 90% done. And then just when it's 100% done, you're done, right? But that's like efficient. That's correct. But that's not necessarily interesting or relevant to the user at all, right? Like, why should the user care if the server's 70% done or 80% done? They just want to have, like, we just want to give them a good experience. And so what we did is we have this waiting time that is a little volatile. It depends on Facebook's network request. You know, it may take 2 seconds, it may take 20 seconds. So what we did is we just set a cap. We said, okay, you know, it will always take at least 30 seconds. So we have 30 seconds that we can design an experience for the user. And so this is what that looks like. You log in with Facebook, and we start getting your data. Like, we have to get your data from Facebook, and this says like establishing a connection, and then it says establishing a secure connection. Now we're filtering through, we're showing you all your wall posts, and then we're highlighting certain words. And this is all like misdirection, right? And then this radar chart, it kind of morphs into the final shape. And that's me, that's my personality, right? That's who I am, and it's believable because I know what the system did. Like, I know what the visualization, how it got there, right? Like, it took my data, it highlighted words, and then it played around with a shape, and that's me, right? Like, so I understand at an abstract level what's going on. Like, the user, the user doesn't have to know like what algorithms, how we're doing the machine learning to get this result. Like that's completely useless information to the user. All they need to know is that we're doing something and they can trust us and the story is interesting to them. And I think it worked. This was featured at the last I/O conference. The keynote speaker included this in his presentation, which was like kind of the highlight of my data viz life. And then when we launched it, 10 days after launching it, we had over 200 million unique personalities generated from Facebook. We had almost 10% of Facebook's total user data just from this like little personality generator. And I don't think it would have been that successful if we just showed a loading bar and didn't think about that initial hook, that initial experience, right? Like people believe it, so now they want to share it. And another interesting thing too about this is when people do share it, and then when it's wrong, and it's wrong a lot of the time, nobody blames us, right? Like they understand that it's their data, they're providing the data, so they're the ones that are wrong, right? So that's just like the way that you present an experience changes how a person perceives it. And it's really easy just to overlook this whole loading process because it's something we're so blind to. But I think if we can exploit this loading process, let's take advantage of it. I think we can create some better experiences. So we talked a little bit about that initial hook. How can we start off the experience? And there are no silver bullets. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. If you're creating a custom visualization, you're telling a custom story. You're telling a custom experience. There's no way to just say what worked for me is going to work for you. Like these techniques, maybe they're not going to work for you. Maybe they're not effective depending on what you're visualizing. But one technique that I have found to be pretty helpful for myself, at least, is SVG filters. And before going into what SVG filters are, I'd just like to tell a quick story about being right versus being happy. Years ago, my girlfriend and I at the time were having an argument. We're married now, and she's my wife. She made cookies, so don't worry. But we're having this argument, and you know how these things go. Like, I'm always right, she's wrong, and the argument's dragging out, and she says something that really had a profound impact on me. It took a while to sink in. After she said it, of course, But she said, "Do you want to be right, or do you want to be happy?" At the time, I thought, oh, this is something that somebody that's wrong says, right? Like, of course I want to be right, like, duh. But after this sunk in, I really thought about this, and it changed my perspective, it changed my worldview on a lot of things, because I could cling to my righteousness. I could say that I'm right, like I am subjectively and objectively right, like I'm right, you're wrong, nanner. But does that make anybody happy? Like, it doesn't make the other person happy, and if the other person's happy, then I'm not going to be happy, and so nobody's happy, and then what does being right even mean? Like, where's the value in that? And so the reason that I wanted to tell this little story was because we can't talk about filters without talking about chart junk and Edward Tufte and what he has to say about it. So he says, chart junk does not achieve the goals of its propagators. The overwhelming fact of data graphics is that they stand or fall on their content gracefully displayed. So Edward Tufte doesn't like chart junk, and chart junk is just anything that obscures this data to ink ratio. If it's not the bar chart, if it's decoration, it's junk. Don't use it. The thing is, like, he's right in a lot of cases. Like this, you can't really argue with this in some aspects. If we're designing bar charts for a white paper, for a scientific journal or a scientific magazine, then the audience is scientists, and it's very important that you don't include anything that obscures the data. Like, you only want to show the data, you want to show it as effectively as possible. But when you're designing for other audiences, this rule about chart chunk may not really apply as much. And to kind of illustrate this point, we create data visualizations, we create stories, we create experiences. So let's take this quote and let's think about it in terms of something else. And if we say the overwhelming fact of books is that they stand or fall on their content, gracefully written, any words or any sort of use of English that isn't really on point, it's going to ruin the book. If that were true, how do we explain this? Right? Twilight is like a hugely successful book series, and if we judged it just based on the content of its writing, I mean, you can't go on the internet and like you go on the internet, you're gonna find like 20 people hating on Twilight, in the first 5 seconds. Like, a lot of people think that it's poorly written and that it's a sign of like America's downfall and print is dying and people are dumb. And I mean, come on, like, if we judge it and like it's not a work of masterful English, but it resonates with a lot of people really well. I mean, this person has Twilight tattooed on their back. Like, it works. Like, this creates an amazing experience for a lot of people. And we could cling to our belief that, like, no, this is not good English literature. Like, you're wrong. But while we're saying they're wrong, like, they're having a good time. They're enjoying their experience. And who are we to take away from their enjoyment? And so before, I talk a little bit more about this, just want to keep in mind that your audience is like the key focus. If you're designing for scientists or if you're designing for data visualizers, then maybe chart chunk is not going to be a good tool. But if you're designing for the general public, perhaps we can use some of these tools to create better experiences. And this whole thing about being right versus being happy, I'm not trying to say, I'm not advocating that you go out and you be like Fox News. This isn't chart chunk, this is just lying with data. This is like 8.6%, 9.0%, and 8.6 is like lower than 9. Like, no, don't lie with data, of course. Don't be Fox News. But, think about, don't just get rid of chart chunk because, one of the, most prominent figures in data visualization says it's bad. Think about the user first. Sometimes chart chunk's going to be a terrible choice, but other times it's going to be pretty useful. And let's look at some examples of SVG filters. What filters can do? What kind of chart chunk we can create? So, let's look at the interest curve example. This is just a line chart. I've added a filter to it, and it's got this kind of jagged edge effect. It takes this standard line chart and it gives it some flavor, it gives it some dimension. And you could argue that this is obscuring the data, and that might be true. But just as you need to think about the audience, you also need to think about what your data is and what your goals are. Something like interest, I mean, maybe we have values of 0.75 and 0.8 and 0.3, but these are very subjective things. So in this case, this is actually an amazing fit for trying to visualize interest because by nature of the data, it's kind of nebulous. How can you say oh, the hook is 0.065 for you, but then 0.062 for you? Having this little bit of nebulous chart chunk can really illuminate the data a little bit. It's actually, I think, a lot more truthful to use chart chunk in situations like this where your data is a little nebulous. Back to the 5 labs example, we had these radar charts. They're not the most effective choice, but personality data, how do you even quantify that? So maybe using the most scientific, the most efficient data viz is not the best route. If we have ambiguous data, maybe we've got data that has some sort of error range. We know that the values are relatively this or that. Maybe we can apply a blur filter and we can kind of see just a general shape of the data. Or maybe we're not doing anything like with data at all, but we want to take something that's really simple, like a square and a circle, and make it look a little more interesting. Give it like a watercolor effect. You know, the way that a user perceives your visualization changes what they take away from it. So it's kind of a misnomer just to say that chart chunk is always bad, because you're creating experiences, and this is hard to do. Like, this is way harder. I mean, you know, I spent months and months learning the dot enter, dot append. Like, I probably took longer than any of you guys took to really understand it. But this stuff, like, this is an order of magnitude harder. I mean, there is no objective right answer. You just have to trial and error. You have to see what works best for the audience. And so with this filter, you know, let's say we want to create like a fog of war effect. And it's maybe a little hard to see, but you know, instead of just showing a circle and blackness, we can show a circle that's kind of got this like faded edge effect. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that I started, this was a few years back. I just started playing around with filters, and you know, my first reaction to them was, Tufts says they're bad, I'm going to stay away from them, but you know, I like to learn, so maybe I'll just check them out. And so I was playing this game called Guild Wars at the time, and they released this visualization that showed player data about what choices, what characters the players created. You know, what races, what classes they picked. And so I looked at this and I thought, like, this looks like something that, you know, somebody opened up like Microsoft Excel and just spit out a data viz for it. Like, from a data viz point of view, like, it's kind of effective. There are some things that I think are wrong with it, but, you know, like, it's bar charts and a pie chart. Okay, so what? This doesn't fit the aesthetic of the game. It doesn't fit the aesthetic of the experience that I expect to have when I see something like this. So, you know, I took this, and instead of just complaining and saying, well, this sucks, like, okay, what can I do? Like, I want to play around with this. I'm playing with filters. Let's see what I can come up with. And so this is what I came up with. It's using just a couple filters, and I get this really cool like watercolor effect, but it's really simple to do, actually. And you know, I have to admit, like, when I look at that giant circle on the left, like, the data visualizer inside of me kind of cringes a little bit, because not only do I hate donut charts, this is 4 donut charts and a pie chart. There's no like hierarchy here. Like, technically this should be like a tree map, like a radial tree map, a sunburst chart, right? But no, it's just donut charts. And I don't like donut charts, but like, I stepped outside of myself for a second, and I put the user first, and I developed the visualization from the user's point of view. And this is a game, you know, it's a game, and the aesthetics are like this watercolor kind of aesthetics. And you know, you could argue that this obscures the data, and you would be 100% correct. But also, like, keep in mind the data. You know, if I'm playing this game and I have 5 characters, but I only play one of them, like, the data is already a little bit nebulous. So in this case, you know, this might actually be a better data visualization choice than showing like very precise, efficient bar charts. You know, you're creating experiences. The experience is dependent on the user and the data. You know, this won't work for like 99% of data visualizations, but when, you know, this particular filter, it adds a lot to this experience. And it went viral. It was on the Reddit front page. It was on the #1 spot in Hacker News. And it reached, you know, if we measure like what makes a visualization effective, we could look at, you know, what's the data to ink ratio, and that's one way to view it. And if you view it that way, chart chunk like completely ruins it. But if we view the success of a visualization in terms of how many people does it reach, how many stories are people creating with it, like how engaged are people with it, if we measure it by that metric, then this was way more effective. You know, I created this over 2.5 years ago, and just like last month, people were talking about it on Reddit. And they weren't doing that with the original visualization. Like this, just adding this chart chunk, you know, it's kind of sounds like a derogatory word, but it makes the experience a little better for a specific audience. So we've talked a little bit about like what filters are. Real quickly, without getting too technical, I want to show you a tool that we can use for creating filters. And this is something a good friend of mine, Nils, he showed me Inkscape a few years ago. And with Inkscape, what we can do, it's really cool. So there's this GUI interface for creating filters. The UI of Inkscape is pretty bad, but what it can do is actually, it's pretty impressive. So we're just going to create a simple box. And we're going to come up here to this filter editor. And this provides you a bunch of filters out of the box. So let's just give something that we're all familiar with, a drop shadow. Let's make this really big. Make it a really dark drop shadow. And now we got a drop shadow. So not only are there all these filters that are predefined, the cool thing about this is this filter editor. And again, the UI is not so great, but if I can get this here, filters are really complex, at least in my mind. I've been using them for a couple years, and still I'm really trying to deeply understand how to use them, because there are all these different components that can feed into each other. You can have a turbulence filter that feeds into a blur filter, and then you can feed that into the square itself, and then maybe you can create some clouds, and you can do all sorts of crazy shit with it. And with Inkscape, you can actually edit each individual part, and these things cascade. So if we make this really big, and if we had other filters attached to it, these effects would propagate downwards. So it's a lot better, I think, than just trying to use HTML tags and play around with the values yourself. You got this nice editor. And then one final thing that's cool about it is we can save it as an SVG file, save it on the desktop, and now we just saved it. Let's go ahead and open it. We can open this with Chrome or whatever, and there you go. It gives you the filter. If we view source, this is the only code that you'll see in the talk. We see this is the filter, and here are all the different filter effects: composite, blur. If we break open these developer tools and look at it, see all these filter effects, and we can even change them right here too. We can say this is 0, and then we get a slightly different effect. So with Inkscape, you're able to create these filters and then play with them in the browser. So it's a really powerful way to start experimenting with filters. And I find it to be a really helpful tool. I talked about Guild Wars. That was a game. I'm a big game nerd. And so I couldn't have this talk without including some sort of discussion about video games. And not just because I think they're cool and I think they're great, but because I feel that design, like Mike Bostock said this, design is a search problem. And you may look at sometimes I look at all these visualizations that people create. I'm subscribed to that, the Dashing D3 newsletter. And I look at all these things that people create, and I just think, whoa, these people are so talented. I am nowhere near as talented or creative as them. And it's a little discouraging. But if we view design as a search problem, then everybody has these skills. You can go find good examples of good design and then take the good parts from them. There's this quote, good artists copy and great artists steal. And at first I heard that and I'm well, that's bullshit. Why do great artists steal other people's work? That's degrading their work. But no, you zoom out a little bit. By stealing, I think it means you're finding what works. You're finding that core idea behind what makes it so good, and you're taking that core idea. When you're creating a visualization or when you're crafting an experience, you're doing this anyway. You're just doing it subconsciously. You may have seen a cool visualization 2 months ago, and it may not be in your conscious mind that oh, I'm making this visualization, I'm going to do something original, but you do something and it's already been done before. So if instead you look at design as a search problem and you say, okay, what can I take from the visualizations I like and use in my own visualization, I think it can be really powerful. So And the reason I want to talk about games is because, and I could talk about games all night, but without getting too philosophical, games are like kind of a superset of a bunch of different art forms. You've got movies, you've got sound, you've got story, you've got animation. All these things are melded into a game. And so game designers have to struggle with creating experiences that involve a lot of different disciplines. And so they have a lot of unique solutions that just authors or just drawers or just storytellers may not have. And so I think it can be useful to look at a couple examples of data viz that I love. And without getting too far into it, we can kind of classify data visualization in games in two ways. And the first way I want to talk about is status visualizations. And like a subset of this is diegetic versus non-diegetic interfaces. And don't be too overwhelmed with all these words. They're just kind of fancy words. Diegetic just means it exists inside of the world, like inside the game world, or inside the book, inside of the theater, inside of the play. Non-diegetic means it exists just for the audience, right? So if you're playing a first-person shooter and there's a heart with a number, that's a non-diegetic interface. That only exists for you, for the player. It doesn't exist for the actual character. And when interfaces are diegetic, when they exist inside of the game world, I think they can really help with the immersion. And if we view design as a search problem, and we try to take away what works in games and apply it to visualizations that we create, I think we can have some pretty cool effects. So the first example I want to show is my all-time favorite example of data viz in games, and the game is called Dead Space. And it's a third-person space zombie shooter game. And it might be kind of weird that I'm not talking about Civilization or StarCraft or games where the data is super important. No, my favorite example is a shooting game. And I want to explain why. So first off, this is a screenshot from the actual gameplay. There's no numbers, there's no heart with a health bar. But if you look at this, just take a second to try to figure out what is this character's health? Where would you look for that? So maybe your eyes were drawn to the character itself, and then maybe your eyes were drawn to this little blue thing on its back. And that's the health bar. That's a diegetic interface. It exists for the character. The character actually has the suit of armor with this little blue bar that displays their health. And so not only is that pretty cool, another interesting thing is that the character is always right there in the screen. The character is almost always positioned in the bottom left. So anytime you need to find out what your health is, you just look to the bottom left. And what does this have to do with data visualizations that we create that are outside of games? Well, just thinking about the processes that the designers have to go through is important. One of the goal of this is, how do I show my character's health? And the first thing that we think of is, let's just show a little heart and a number. And that's almost all games. That's the default choice. And you can't say that it's wrong because it works. But it just like in our own visualizations, if we just look for that first obvious answer, I don't think we'll be able to craft experiences that are just as compelling as if we just spend a lot of time to think about every single thing that we put into our visualizations should add to the user's experience. And one other thing too, it's a shooting game, so you need to know how much ammo you have. Well, there's this hologram that shows you what your ammo is and what your weapon is. And this hologram, it's really cool. The designers and developers of this game created a particle system just so they could show holograms for user interface elements inside of the game. That's just so cool. They went through all this work to do things that are completely hidden for users. Nobody is really going to notice this unless you know to look for it. And this kind of gets back to this quote about, good design is invisible. And, with your visualizations, try to look for every single thing that you're adding. Is this the best way? Is this going to be the best thing for the experience? And then another cool thing is that it's hard to see here, but there are these 3 lasers that acts as your crosshair. So, they thought of everything. They've really spent a lot of time thinking about how can we create data viz in a game that's going to be effective. And in our own visualizations, how can we look at every single, the font, the colors, the line height? How are these things going to impact the visualization? How are these going to impact the experience? And so just one other example, another game, Far Cry. I love maps, and they have this awesome map visualization. Your character is actually holding a map in the game, and there are all these different icons on it, and then you got this little radio thing that shows you your location. It's just when you think about, you're kind of thinking outside of the box. How can we create an experience that's going to be so impactful and really kind of add to this broader experience narrative that we're trying to create? So that's status visualizations. Those show you stuff inside of the game. That'd be like a bar chart or a line chart. Another kind of visualization I like to quickly talk about are training visualizations. And without getting too philosophical, I feel like if you're not learning, you're not having fun. Games are about learning. If you're playing a game and you've completely mastered it, the game is no longer fun. Once you know the trick to tic-tac-toe, that's it, it's over. But before you know that trick, it can be a little fun. And so, there are games like gambling, and there are whole genres of games that use other things than learning to keep you playing, like Heyday or Farmville. But I want to focus on games where you're playing and you're learning. And visualizations, if you approach it in that way, visualizations give you the ability to practice. They show you what you've done wrong, and you can improve. So another one of my favorite games is StarCraft 2. And after each game, you get a bunch of bar charts and line charts about your progress. But you also get this ability to watch the replay of your game, and you can see what your enemy was doing at the time. And it shows you a breakdown of what units you were producing and what your economy was like. It gives you ways to understand your gameplay so you can become a better player and have more fun playing the game the next time. It's focused practice. If you're going to play the piano, it's really effective if you have a teacher sitting over your shoulder telling you what you're doing wrong. And so this replay visualization accomplishes that. Same thing for League of Legends, the most popular online game right now. They have amazing visualizations. One reason I feel like it's so successful is because they're so good at teaching you to be a better player. After each game, you have all these charts that show you the kind of experience that you had, so that next time you can play and you can learn and you can be a better player. So, with that in mind, we've talked about interest curves. We've talked about how we can craft an experience and view it in terms of interest over time. We've talked about filters, how we can use filters to kind of add some chart junk to enhance the experience. And then we talked about games a little bit. So I'd like to end by talking about a side project that I've been working on for the past couple years, and it's a data viz-driven game. And so I'm using HTML, JavaScript, and D3 to create this game. My goal is to basically create an experience that has data viz at the core. And so I'd like to show you just a quick demo of it. And so right off the bat, hopefully this aesthetic, if you're not into fantasy games, then this handwritten journal is probably going to turn you off. And that's fine. You know immediately kind of the hook, what the experience is going to be like. And so this text right here, this text is actually a data visualization. Each time you play, this text is automatically generated based on your performance of the previous game, and it changes on each playthrough. And it kind of fades in. It'd be one thing just to show you some bar charts or some line charts. But if we did that, maybe that's not the most effective way to create an experience. So by having this text fade in, we kind of give these little valleys of interest where we can emphasize certain things that we want to show. So this text fades in, and then you type in your name, and then you can select a race. And so it's a little hard to see, but there are 2 races that you've discovered already, and then there are more that you haven't discovered. And so, like just, okay, what's the most effective data viz? Well, let's show like a bar chart of 2 out of 4 races discovered. But if we do that, then we can't show like this shape, the outline of one of these undiscovered races. And maybe this creates a little more interest because you're like kind of curious, like, ooh, what's this race going to be? But this is a fantasy game, so of course you've got the elf and the human. So we select elf, and we have some bars here. And this is just like your standard bar chart, but it has a filter. It has like this kind of like hand-drawn filter applied to it. So hopefully it looks a little diegetic. Maybe it kind of looks like actually somebody wrote in the book and filled in that line. And if we just use like a standard bar chart, like that would draw attention to that visualization and kind of take away from the experience. And if we change our race to human, we see the power go down. Let's look at that again. So the power will go down. And this is another interesting point too, is that there are no numbers here. It's just these bar charts. And this is kind of a subtle thing, but every single choice that you make when you're creating your visualization impacts the experience. If I added numbers, it would emphasize certain things that I don't want to emphasize. I want to show that this is kind of like a relative rating. That the humans are like kind of powerful, but like the elves are way more powerful. But if there's numbers attached to it, it creates a different experience. And it sounds subtle, and it is, because it's just like, do we show numbers or not? But even in your own visualizations that aren't in games, the choice of like where are you going to label things, like this changes the way that people perceive your visualization. So we select our race, and then we can select our class, our profession. And so there are a few listed here, like assassin. And if you don't like assassin, you can be custom. You can create your own. So like right off the bat, we're kind of showing you like what the possible like game space looks like. And after you choose your class, you can choose your skills. And so again, like right here, this is a filter, and we can, if we only want to show damage spells, we can hide these 2 things, and then we're only seeing damage skills. And then you might notice this little red bar, like each skill has a bar, and it shows you what kind of ability it is. So like this ability right here, it has a red bar and a green bar, which means it does damage and it heals. And so again, like what does this have to do with our own visualizations? Oftentimes, when you're creating a visualization, you have to develop some sort of taxonomy for it. And what I mean by that is you have to like categorize your data somehow. And so to illustrate, in this example, I've categorized all skills as either damage skills, debuff skills where they take away strength from the enemy, healing skills where they give you health, and then buff skills where they make you stronger. So there are these 4 broad categories. And when you're developing any kind of taxonomy, it's helpful to think about what the user's taxonomy like what is the taxonomy of the user when they're going into the experience. And I'm developing a game that people might not necessarily know or care what kind of taxonomy I've created, and so it's good to be really broad, because we could break down damage in terms of like really powerful damage spells or like really fast ones that don't do a lot of damage but they like hit really fast. There's all sorts of ways that we could like create subcategories for each of these things. But when we do that, we start to run the risk of mismatching what the user's taxonomy like what their mental model is for what the taxonomy should be with the taxonomy that we create. And like I'm using taxonomy, and I realize like this may sound like kind of fluffy. It's just categories. It's thinking about what the user has in their own mind before they come to your experience. Like you have to think about what preconceived notions do they have? How can we exploit those to create a better experience? And so after you select your skills, we do another textual visualization. And this is a single player game, but the data is aggregated. So we show you like how many other people selected your combination of skills to kind of show you like how unique your choices were. We show you what your abilities were, and if you're happy with your character, you can click Begin Journey and start to play. But unfortunately, I've run out of time, so if you're interested in the game, just come see me after the talk and I'll let you play a demo. But I would like to leave with one more thing. Yo, dog, I heard you like experiences, so we visualized your experience of an experience visualization talk. And I think you guys, maybe you can figure out what's coming next. Of course, the interest curve, right? So your interest in the talk may not have matched like the interest that I designed, but just by virtue of like trying to structure my talk in such a way to include these like peaks and valleys, it's at least given me a tool that enables me to create a better experience than I would have been able otherwise. And it's not, it doesn't really matter if this curve matches your own curve. It's a tool to help you think about the user when you're creating an experience. And so I'd just like to give a quick shout out to my team at Five, Dan, Kyle, Nils, where's Nicholas, and then Dennis. These are the most talented creative people I've ever worked with. We're building a product that we've placed the user first in all our design and development process. You'll hear a lot about us in the next few months, but if you're interested in more, come see us afterwards. And just one final thing, just to reiterate, let's start with the user. Like there are lots of MacBooks in here, and Apple was very successful at placing humans in front of technology. And you could say, well, like Windows machines are faster, like there's better specs, and that's true. But it's just a better experience. And so if we ourselves try to place the user in front of the technology, let's start with the user. Let's design our visualizations from the user's point of view. And by doing so, I think we'll be able to create better, more compelling experiences. Thank you. Yeah, send complaints over there. Sure.
Hey, I consider myself to be like a really bad storyteller, so do you have any tips for someone who's just a neophyte at it?
Sure, absolutely. Have you ever enjoyed a good book or a movie? Like, do you like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones? What's something you like?
Yeah, I mean, let's see, The Good Wife.
Okay, sure. So I'm not familiar with it, but I'm sure that if read it as a user first. I would suggest like experience it just as you would yourself. Like just go through the experience. Don't really try to look for things. Just experience it in its full glory, like how great this experience is. And then when you're done, go through it again and like look for one thing. Maybe apply the interest curve to it. And when you're going through this experience, try to like be cognizant of what the author is doing, what the storyteller is doing at each of those points. Like are there areas where you're gaining interest? Are there areas where you're losing interest? And is this something that they designed, or is it just something that's like a byproduct of what your own experience going in, like what your expectations are? So basically, to sum it up, just look at things that you like, right? Like you have good taste, so like nobody can take that away from you. But like the hard part is actually creating it, And it, like there's this amazing quote by I think it was Ira Glass, who talks about creative people and like the creative process, and he says essentially people have really good taste, and then they get in and they try to do some sort of art form, but then they look at it and they get discouraged because they realize that what they can create doesn't match up to what their tastes are. And that's when like most people give up. right? Because it's like, man, like I'm not good enough. Like my tastes are so good, but I can't make this, so therefore like I'm a shitty artist and I'm not creative. Like I wasn't born with it. Right? But like that's a bullshit excuse. But most people use that because that's the easy way out. And he says just stick with it. Like you just have to create a lot of content, and just by doing so, try to steal like The Good Wife. Like what do you like about it? Try to steal the things that you like and apply it to whatever you're creating. But I mean, I'm right there with you. Like I'm a programmer. Like I'm not a designer, and so like this design stuff has been like super hard for me. But it's at the end of the day, like it's a book or a data visualization. Like it's an experience. So like there's all sorts of things that they share. Like at an abstract level, it almost feels like it's all just design. Like it's all just the same thing. It's how do we create a good experience for the user? Hopefully that helps. Sure.
What are your plans for 5 labs going forward? You've got a great start there. Very exciting start.
Thanks. So 5 labs is actually, we're not doing anything with that. We have all this data. We may use it in our current project, but what we're currently working on is a mobile application that's essentially a better place to hang out on the internet. If you think about like AOL chat rooms back in the day or IRC, like we're trying to create like a better modern version of that. Sure.
How do you go about collecting user stories?
Collecting user stories?
Yeah.
Well, I try to give it to people that like that I know have different experiences than me, because I think oftentimes, it's one thing to like give something that you create to like another programmer or like somebody else that shares a lot of your experiences, because you're gonna like kind of, maybe you like might have these like local optimizations, but like maybe you miss the big picture. So like for instance, like with 5 labs, like I gave that to my mom, and she's like not technical at all, but some of the feedback was really powerful, really interesting. So just finding people that are like outside of your normal like peer group, I think could be helpful. And one caveat with that is always listen to what their problems are, but never listen to how they tell you to solve them. Right? Because everybody will say like, oh yeah, like that, this experience sucks. It would be so much better if it did this. But they're not you. Like they're not designers. Like you wouldn't give a book, like you wouldn't write a book and give it to a reader and have them like edit it and say this is what you should do, right? Because they're not an author. They don't understand like how to write. Or with programming, you give your program to somebody and they find a bug. And they say, well, like I was clicking on my mouse and then there was like a bolt of lightning, and so like the lightning bolt caused this bug, right? Like, no, don't listen to how they tell you how to solve it. Like there was a problem, right? Like they had that experience, but like it's up to you to try to figure out like what the actual problem was. Cool.
Do you find that it's always the same, that story arc with the, what was it, the hook and then the 3 peaks, is it always the same?
It's not necessarily. We can just pull that up again real quick. I wouldn't like say it's always like this, but I think the general shape, like I found that experiences that I really enjoy, like I've tried to apply this to like episodes of Breaking Bad, and just Breaking Bad, like the entire series as a whole. And for me, like I found that like it generally has this kind of shape. One thing also to note is that like this shape can be fractal, right? So like this whole shape could fit inside like right here and right here and right here, right? So like your hook, should have these like peaks and curves that have like some like climax, right? Like each little peak is essentially like a combination of this whole chart. And I found that, I don't know if it's true that like all good experiences have this kind of peak, but I don't like ever remember having a terrible experience and then trying to map it to this and seeing the shape. Right? Like I've had lots of bad experiences, and then like the shape might look like this, right? So, and it's just it's a tool, right? So it's not going to be perfect all the time. It can't be, but at the very least, like, it can help you try to analyze an experience at a deeper level. You know, just like if you open up your debug console and like look through the source code, right? Like this is like a way to look through the source code of an experience in terms of interest. Cool. Anybody else? Cool. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it, and thanks.